What pushes a country that had stayed neutral to cross the line and enter the most devastating war in history? Mexico, proud of its independence and reluctant to get entangled in foreign disputes, watched cautiously as Europe burned from 1939 onward. But in 1942, the waters of the Gulf were marked by fire and stained by oil. German submarines sank the Potrero del Llano and the Faja de Oro, two Mexican ships carrying crude. The attack not only destroyed strategic cargoes, it wounded the nation's honor, and neutrality became unsustainable. And that is how, on May 22, 1942, President Manuel Ávila Camacho declared war on the Axis. This is the story of how Mexico entered the Second World War. May 13, 1942. War touched Mexico's coasts for the first time. The tanker Potrero del Llano, sailing in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, was intercepted by a German U-boat. A torpedo split her in two, leaving the crew in flames and crude floating on the sea.
Entonces esto encendió a México un gran enojo, ¿no? Entonces el presidente, como no teníamos las armas para entrar a la guerra y no queríamos entrar a la guerra, mandó una reclamación porque habían atacado un barco neutral y pedía reparación de los daños, ¿no? El barco y la gente que murió.
But on May 20th, another attack shook the country again. The Faja de Oro was the second Mexican ship sunk by a German vessel under similar circumstances, and the news raced across Mexico like lightning. The popular reaction was immediate. At the universities, students marched with banners demanding reprisals. In the countryside, campesinos listened to the radio with contained fury, wondering why their ships were being attacked without provocation. In the cities, workers filled plazas and streets, outraged that neutrality had been met with violence. The national feeling was unanimous. Mexico could not remain impassive. Then President Manuel Ávila Camacho, a prudent man aware of the risks, understood that the country had reached a breaking point. The direct attack left no room for doubt.
La población también reaccionó. Los ataques conmovieron a toda la sociedad mexicana y se instaló el debate. Hubo discusiones, gritos y llantos. Y finalmente el gobierno hizo una encuesta de tipo referéndum y el resultado fue que el 40% de la población pensaba que declarar la guerra a Alemania estaba bien. Y así México entró en la Segunda Guerra Mundial.
On May 22, 1942, Mexico broke diplomatic relations with the Axis powers and formally declared war. It was a historic step. For the first time in over a century of independence, Mexico joined a global conflict. The war that had seemed so distant was no longer a foreign spectacle, but a tangible threat in its waters. What began as an attack on two tankers became a decisive turning point in the country's history. Honor, sovereignty, and national security were at stake, and Mexico chose to fight. Nevertheless, to understand the significance of that decision, we must go back a few years. After the whirlwind of the Mexican Revolution, the country was still moving through a process of political and social reconstruction. The 1930s were marked by agrarian reforms, tensions between military and civilian sectors, and an economy trying to modernize without losing sight of its rural roots. When the Second World War broke out in Europe in 1939, Mexico adopted an official stance of neutrality, and this was nothing new, since it had done the same during the First World War. However, this time, the situation was different. Sympathy for the Allies was clear. The memory of Mexico's support for the Spanish Republic during the Civil War, together with ideological rejection of fascism, tipped the political and moral balance toward the Allied bloc. President Manuel Ávila Camacho, who took office in 1940 after Lázaro Cárdenas, understood that the country had to be cautious. Mexico needed internal stability because wounds from the revolution were still open and the economy was barely recovering from the Great Depression. Even so, the global conflict also offered a strategic opportunity. The United States, immediate neighbor and rising power, was looking for reliable allies in the American continent. Keeping close to Washington without committing directly was, in principle, the best move. Thus, between 1939 and 1941, Mexico lived in watchful neutrality, officially distant, but with diplomatic and economic gestures that favored the Allies. What no one imagined was that in a matter of months, that prudent distance would be altered, imposed by the war itself in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico.
El gobierno primero habló de la unidad nacional y el presidente Ávila Camacho se atrevió a reunir a los expresidentes mexicanos un solo día en el balcón central del Palacio Nacional, no obstante que la mayoría de ellos habían terminado siendo enemigos durante la Revolución Mexicana. Así que la radio también se sumó a esa gran campaña para convencer a la opinión pública de que era lo mejor entrar a la guerra.
Once popular support had been won, Mexico entered the war and an immediate debate opened. Should the country send troops to the front? The United States, its closest ally, valued above all Mexican oil, minerals, and labor. But Ávila Camacho's government insisted that the nation must also have direct military representation.
El gobierno de México empezó a pensar en qué forma podía participar físicamente en la contienda y decidieron que lo más práctico, lo más económico, lo más fácil de conjuntar y de entrenar era un escuadrón aéreo.
Thus was born Fighter Squadron 201, known as Las Águilas Aztecas, composed of around 300 men, pilots, mechanics, and support personnel. The squadron was sent to the United States in 1944 to receive training. There they learned to master the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, among the most robust and versatile aircraft of the war. For months they trained in dive bombing tactics, close air support, and reconnaissance. The pilots, mostly young men, wore on their uniforms the emblem of a Mexican golden eagle, a symbol of pride and courage. And in 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, Squadron 201 was finally ready for action, and it was assigned to the Pacific under the command of U.S. General Douglas MacArthur.
No se decide que vaya un escuadrón compuesto por 16 pilotos y unos 280 hombres de tropa, entre mecánicos y abastecedores de armamento y meteorólogos, malos oficiales de Estado Mayor, que sea la que vaya a prepararse para combatir en el frente del Pacífico en los últimos combates, en los últimos reductos que no fueron las Islas Filipinas.
The Mexican men joined the campaign to liberate Philippine territory, and from the Porac Air Base on Luzon, they took part in more than 90 combat missions. Their operations included bombing Japanese positions, providing air support to Allied ground troops, and reconnaissance flights. In the battle for Luzon, Las Águilas Aztecas attacked enemy fortifications hidden in the jungle and columns of vehicles trying to reinforce Japanese lines. They also carried out raids on the island of Formosa, striking fuel depots and communications centers.
Se combatía todavía muy fuertemente en las Filipinas cuando llegamos. Y además, por otro lado, pues ustedes saben que era un escuadrón aéreo. Nuestras participaciones en combate eran precisamente de ametrallamiento y de bombardeo a fuerzas de tierra.
The war was drawing to a close, but it was no less brutal for that. 5 Mexican pilots were killed in action, and several aircraft were shot down or suffered serious damage. Despite the losses, the contribution of this Mexican force was recognized with honors by Allied forces. For Mexico, Squadron 201 represented much more than a military contingent. It was the national flag flying on a distant front, a reminder that the country had fully assumed its place in the war. When they returned in November 1945, Las Águilas Aztecas were welcomed as heroes. Their feat was engraved in national memory as the most visible chapter of Mexican military participation in the Second World War.
Al escuadrón se le asignan 30,000 bajas de japoneses. O sea que la participación del escuadrón fue buena.
Now then, the war did not only transform the seas of the Gulf and the skies over the Philippines, it also changed the daily life of millions of Mexicans. By becoming a strategic ally of the United States, Mexico became a key supplier of essential raw materials for the Allies. Oil flowed north, metals such as zinc and tungsten were shipped to armaments factories, and the agricultural fields increased production to feed armies on the march. And one of the most emblematic programs of this cooperation was the Bracero program. In 1942, Mexico and the United States signed an agreement to send agricultural workers to the northern neighbor.
We have this moment of increased national production in the United States, men leaving to go to war, but at the same time increased production in terms of building ships, building airplanes, creating enough food, just getting the economy up and running to deal with the war effort.
Amid a labor shortage, hundreds of thousands of Mexican campesinos crossed the border to sustain U.S. agricultural and industrial production. This mass migration not only eased labor tensions in the United States, it also durably changed the labor and social relationship between the two countries. However, not everything was positive.
Las condiciones de trabajo de los mexicanos en los Estados Unidos no eran fáciles, el salario era bajo, las condiciones de vida eran complicadas, vivienda, alimentación, es decir, todo aquello que se había ofrecido no se cumplía, además de que había una gran discriminación hacia el trabajo realizado por mexicanos allá, sobre todo proveniente de los sectores sindicales y algunos grupos políticos que veían como amenaza, como hoy en día se ve, la migración laboral en otro país.
The least fortunate could even be left out of the program's meager benefits. People arrived in droves. Thousands upon thousands of Mexicans crossed the border, but not all of them were hired. If they were not accepted and had no money to return to their lands, they wandered the streets looking for something to eat. Some people even died of hunger, and there was no one to do anything for them. All these stories were little known. They reached home only through witnesses who saw their compatriots suffer without being able to do anything to prevent it, since they too were victims of labor exploitation and harsh conditions in the United States. And as if that were not enough, the production boom brought with it social tensions, shortages of certain goods, and an accelerated pace of economic change that not everyone could absorb. Even so, the balance was clear. The war not only inserted Mexico into the global arena, it also marked the beginning of a structural transformation of its economy and its collective identity. According to the official account, Mexican participation in the war had become an element of social cohesion. Workers, campesinos, and students felt that their work or their daily sacrifices had a larger purpose, helping to defeat fascism. The rhetoric spoke of defending democracy and protecting sovereignty, connecting international struggles with national pride. But the price of war was not measured only in human lives. On the home front, economic transformation brought with it a new dependency. Mexico strengthened its link with the United States, but it also became more tied to the dynamics of its northern neighbor. The Bracero program, presented at the outset as a temporary measure, opened the door to massive migratory flows that forever reconfigured the relationship between the two countries. At the same time, accelerated industrialization generated social tensions and inequalities that would not be easily resolved in the post-war period.
The Bracero program may have ended, but labor shortages for certain jobs persist in the United States, along with the debate about Mexican workers.
And so what you see from really World War II to today is this constant ebb and flow of policy and ideology about the place of these transient Mexican workers in the U.S. economy. And they're vital to portions of the U.S. economy. And the question becomes politically how you deal with that labor issue.
In political terms, participation in the war gave Mexico unprecedented international recognition. It was invited to join multilateral organizations, and it consolidated its role as a regional power in Latin America. The official discourse stressed that Mexico had defended democracy abroad and that, thanks to this, it had earned a place at the table of nations. But beyond politics and economics, the legacy was also cultural and social. The memory of Las Águilas Aztecas helped forge a shared sense of national pride. Their feat became an example of discipline, unity, and devotion to duty. At the same time, the experiences of thousands of Braceros and the contact with the U.S. war effort left their mark on the daily lives of countless Mexican families. The Second World War marked a turning point. Mexico left behind its historical isolation and projected itself into a broader international arena. The sacrifice of a few and the economic and social contribution of millions redefined the country's position in the world. Although its intervention was brief and limited in military terms, its significance was profound. Mexico had shown that it could be more than a spectator. It could be an actor on the global stage. From a Mexico that feared destabilization to a Mexico that returned with heroes, international respect, and a place of its own in the history books. That was the true legacy of its passage through the Second World War. With that, we reach the end. If you enjoyed this video, we'll be waiting for you in our next installment to keep exploring military history.